He just wanted to eat his lunch in peace, but that plain bowl of noodles was about to flip the entire prison hierarchy on its head. Cold water dripped down Elias Song's face as he held his chopsticks steady, noodles still dangling between his fingers. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just blinked slow, like nothing had happened, like the overturned jug hadn't even touched him. Standing over him, massive and bare-chested, Crusher Malone smirked with contempt, waiting for a reaction. Any reaction. But Elias just kept eating, quiet, calm. The mess hall at St. Redmond Maximum Security, out in the Arizona desert, froze on the spot. Inmates stopped chewing mid-bite. Guards pretended not to notice. Every single set of eyes locked onto that table. This wasn't just some prank. It was a warning. Malone had just marked the rookie as his new target. Malone was prison royalty, 2 meters tall, built like a tank, and carrying a rap sheet so violent even the guards kept their distance. He ruled with an iron fist, trading fear like currency. Every fresh fish that walked in was his chance to re-establish dominance. And Elias, with his calm posture and harmless appearance, looked like the perfect victim. But nobody knew what that quiet man was really hiding behind those steady eyes. Elias had only arrived the week before. Clean record inside. No fights, no aggression. White-collar charges looked harmless enough. He spent his time reading, keeping his cell spotless, and practicing what most inmates assumed were just slow stretches out in the yard. To them, he was just some weird guy who didn't belong. But there was something in his eyes. Something even Malone couldn't figure out. The cafeteria stunt was only the beginning. Over the next days, Elias got shoved, tailed, his bed flipped, his books ripped apart, and every single time he reacted the same way, by not reacting. That drove Malone insane. He craved screams, fear, rage. What he got instead was silence. On the 4th night, Malone decided the game was over. He stormed into Elias's cell with 2 of his goons. The security camera glitched for exactly 4 minutes. When the feed came back on, 2 bodies were sprawled out cold on the floor. Malone was staggering, nose busted, eyes wide in pure terror. Elias, he was sitting exactly where he'd been before, reading the same book, same silence. By morning, the whispers spread through the prison like wildfire. The new guy dropped Crusher with 1 move. Like a damn ghost. But he wasn't a ghost. Elias Song was a traditional kung fu master, trained since the age of 5, a direct disciple of one of the last living Shaolin masters in America. He'd left everything behind after his sister's mysterious death. Prison was supposed to be his hiding place. But now, exposed, he knew there was no staying invisible. Malone, humiliated in front of the other inmates, swore vengeance, but he had no clue about the storm he had just unleashed. Because Elias wasn't just a man with fighting skills, he carried a purpose, and that purpose was about to unfold, piece by piece, in the weeks to come. Something darker was brewing inside St. Redmond, something tied not only to Elias, but to his sister's death, an underground fight ring, and corruption running deep within the guards themselves. And with every step, Elias would prove one thing: true strength isn't in the muscles. It's in the silence of a man who knows exactly when to strike. After the cafeteria incident, Elias was no longer just the weird rookie. He was being watched by everyone, whispered about, feared by some, and courted by prison gangs looking to recruit him. But he turned them all down. He barely slept, always keeping one eye open, and his daily routine followed strange, exact patterns. 3 laps around the yard every morning, 5 deep breaths before each meal, and slow, almost choreographed movements, as if he were practicing something no one else could understand. Malone, meanwhile, was drowning in his own rage. Being challenged, he could stomach that. Being ignored, never. And the rookie hadn't just beaten him physically, he'd humiliated him in front of the entire prison. Even the guards, the toughest among them, whispered about the silent bone breaker the nickname Elias was starting to earn. It was as if Malone's grip on St. Redmond was slipping away, not by brute force, but by something deeper: silent respect. The tension hit a boiling point when a new message showed up, smeared in blood across the bathroom mirror. Not all monsters scream. The warning didn't come from Elias, but the impact was explosive. Crews started shifting. Gangs that once followed Malone began to fracture. Some believed Elias was part of something bigger, a covert op, maybe a trained assassin. Others whispered an even wilder theory, that he'd been planted inside the prison for a reason. But no one knew what that reason was. Elias never confirmed a thing. He stuck to his silence, his discipline, his unshakable routine. But in his eyes, there was something only a few managed to catch: guilt. With every shove he ignored, every punch he dodged, it was as if he carried an invisible weight, like he was holding back something he refused to unleash. That wasn't fear, it was restraint. And when someone that dangerous is restraining themselves that hard, the world should be terrified of the moment they stop. Then something unexpected happened. A new guard, Dempsey, walked up to Elias and silently handed him a sealed envelope. Elias opened it, and for a brief second, his gaze went blank. The letter had come from outside the prison. Inside, a single handwritten line: "They know you're here." Elias folded the paper, sat back in his corner, and didn't move for almost an hour. From that moment on, everything shifted. The story that had seemed to be about an unusual inmate was about to reveal that the real conflict hadn't even begun. St. Redmond Maximum wasn't just a holding pen for broken men. It was its own ecosystem, divided not only by concrete and bars, but by unwritten rules, codes set by inmates, not the administration. The old guards knew full well that controlling the men was an illusion. What really kept the place steady was a fragile balance between the factions, and any wobble in that equilibrium could spark a quiet riot or full-blown war. Block C was ruled by three powers: the Latinos under El Chino Vargas, the white supremacists led by Kurt Madsen, and the so-called neutrals, a crew that kept to themselves but answered directly to Malone. Elias's arrival upset that balance. He didn't fit into any lane. He didn't seek allies, didn't bite at threats, never got close to anyone. Still, slowly, he became the block's center of gravity. Meanwhile, in the admin wing, Guard Dempsey kept a low profile. He'd been on the job only a few months and seemed too straight-laced to survive in a place like that, but he wasn't there by accident. An ex-military man with a background in infiltration ops, he'd been transferred under a special recommendation after a failed mission on the Mexico border. The envelope he handed Elias was just the start. Dempsey knew more than he let on. Elias's presence at St. Redmond wasn't coincidence. Elias was also catching the eye of someone unexpected: Vargas. The Latino leader, respected for his intelligence and tactical sense, watched the rookie with growing interest. During a yard session, Vargas slid up, sat on the bench beside Elias, and simply watched him move. "Shaolin?" he asked flatly. Elias didn't answer. He offered a faint half smile. Vargas read it. Dangerous, but honorable. And honor was rare currency inside those walls. Back with Malone, paranoia was sinking in. The loss still throbbed in his body and his pride. His crew started to whisper about his leadership. One of them, Styx, was still recovering from the attack and refused to say what he'd seen. "It happened too fast," he kept repeating. "I didn't even see the punch." In a world where strength ruled, being beaten by silence was the worst kind of humiliation. Malone began digging. He wanted to know who Elias really was, where he came from, and why a man with that kind of skill was locked up for a paper crime. In his cell, Elias replayed the letter in his head. The handwriting felt familiar. The anonymous sender had used codes he'd known since childhood. The note wasn't just a warning. It was a summons, a reminder that what he'd been running from outside had found him inside, and that the people behind his sister's death now knew where to look. What nobody knew yet was that the prison was only a stage. Behind St. Redmond's walls, a clandestine network ran illegal fights featuring inmates, streamed to international bettors. The bouts were organized by a coalition of corrupt guards and faction bosses, and Elias, with his skills, was the next product they wanted to sell, willing or not. To do that, they had to break him, or force a reaction. Malone was their first instrument. But other plans were already in motion. Dempsey, torn between duty and truth, started to ask himself, who exactly was the prisoner in cell 36A? Why would a man with elite training, a clean record and monastic discipline be tied to such a petty crime? The gears were turning, and while St. Redmond's corridors looked business as usual, something much larger was moving beneath the surface. The letter had been only the beginning. 2 days later, Elias woke to the dry rattle of chains. He'd been moved to temporary solitary under the pretense of a sanitary inspection in his block. He knew that was a lie. In the cold, dark cell, no contact, no books, no natural light. Time stretched into a slow, silent torture. The system was trying to break him, not with force but by erasure. Across the prison, Malone set his pieces. Humiliated, he accepted an offer from a man who wore a staff badge but didn't exist on any official roster. A so-called external security coordinator. In reality, he was the head of the fight ring. Gareth Price made his intentions clear. Elias is valuable. You, Malone, will be the bait to get him to the ring. The plan was simple. Provoke Elias until he snapped on camera. One move, one strike, and they'd have enough to list him as a volunteer in the clandestine fights. Streams behind a paywall, backed by underworld heavy hitters. Price wanted spectacle, blood and skill sold together. No one offered a better product than Elias. Dempsey, meanwhile, managed to access part of the prison's hidden files. He found references to a subterranean level, off the maps, where the fights took place. He also learned that the footage from the night Malone stormed Elias's cell had been wiped. The 4 minutes of glitch had been deliberate. Every clue pulled Dempsey deeper into the mess. The investigation that brought him there was turning into something way bigger than any op he'd known. Even in isolation, Elias sensed what was coming. With no mirror, no book, no one to speak to, he used the cell walls for company. He traced old ideograms with his finger, the ones his grandfather had taught him. He breathed in cycles, trained with the weight of his own body. He wasn't waiting to be freed. He was preparing for the inevitable. He knew the system didn't want only to silence him, they wanted to weaponize him. Elias was no longer just an inmate. He was a commodity. On the 4th day, they pulled him out of solitary without warning and marched him straight to the mess hall. Everyone was there. Malone was there, grinning. The setup felt staged, overstaffed guards, cameras angled, attention cranked up. Elias knew it was theater. Still, he sat. He picked up his chopsticks. He served himself in silence. He knew what was coming. Malone slid up from behind, just like before. This time he carried a tray of scalding soup. He dumped it over Elias. The broth ran down the uniform, searing, burning. A few inmates stood. The guards did nothing. They let it play out. They wanted to see the monk react. One hit, one answer, anything. Elias lifted his eyes. He said nothing. He stood up, slowly, looked at Malone, and in a movement barely noticeable, wiped his face with the sleeve of his uniform and sat back down. Silence fell heavy. And then, Price, watching the feeds, murmured, "He's better than I thought." But Elias knew that control wouldn't last. The next day, a different blow came from another direction. Nico, one of Malone's old henchmen, was found dead in the laundry, hung with a sheet. Beside the body, a message carved into the wall. "The next one is you, monk." Now the game had changed. It wasn't taunting anymore. It was a real threat. Watching the body being carried out, Elias understood he could no longer ignore it. People were dying because of him. Even by doing nothing, he'd become the epicenter of a conflict that went beyond honor into survival, corruption, and murder. And in that moment, he did something he hadn't done in years. He went to Dempsey, looked the guard in the eye, and said, "Take me to the underground." St. Redmond Prison wasn't just a place of punishment. It was a machine running on multiple levels. While Elias prepared to descend into the underground, other pieces were quietly shifting. Vargas, the Latino boss, received an unusual visit in the interrogation room. His sister, Lucia. Officially, she was there to discuss legal matters. But under the table, she slid him a photo that made Vargas go pale. Elias, standing beside a dead man. The same man tied to the fall of the rival cartel Vargas had been trying to dismantle for years. Lucia wasn't just his sister. She was a DEA informant, embedded in the legal world. She came with a clear message. Protect Elias. He's the key to bringing down the network. Vargas, who had seen Elias only as an enigma, now saw him as a weapon, but protecting him meant standing against Malone and against Price. Tension in Block C thickened in silence. Glances shifted. Movements became sharper. The whole prison felt like it was counting down to something, though no one knew what. Meanwhile, Dempsey wrestled with his own demons. Every lead pulled him deeper. He uncovered that Price was an ex-private security agent linked to disappearances in the Middle East, and that St. Redmond's fight ring was just one of 6 operating inside U.S. prisons. Elias hadn't been jailed by mistake. He'd been placed there. The fraud charges, fabricated, the conviction papers, forged. But why? Who had the power to bend the system like that? Malone, on the other hand, received an ultimatum. If Elias doesn't step into the ring within 48 hours, you will. Against someone trained. The humiliation alone drove him into a frenzy. In blind rage, he broke one of his own men's hands, but a new idea surfaced. If Elias wouldn't react to direct provocation, what if they went after someone innocent? The next morning, an inmate from Block B, a young guy who'd spoken only a few words to Elias in the yard, was slashed with a makeshift blade. He barely survived. On the floor, taped beside the blood, was a note. "How long will you let others bleed for you, Elias?" Something snapped inside him. Elias knew that if he struck back with violence, he'd be stepping into exactly the trap the system had set. But inaction was costing lives. The balance between wisdom and action was crumbling. Alone in his cell for the first time, he broke routine. He smashed the meditation wall with his fists. Blood dripping from his hands marked the start of a new chapter. That night, Dempsey led him into the underground. The path ran through a restricted corridor hidden behind the infirmary. There lay the fight hub, cameras, lights, and an improvised ring surrounded by wires, betting stations, and screens. Elias glanced around, as though recognizing the smell. He'd been in places like this before. He had fought. He had killed. But that wasn't what made him hesitate. What paralyzed him was knowing that this time he wasn't fighting just to survive. He was about to go up against an entire system that had chosen him as a target before he even knew he was playing. In the control room, Price watched through the monitors, grinning. The countdown had begun, and the ghosts Elias had tried to bury were all waiting for him down there. The underground arena was cloaked in near-ceremonial darkness. Men in suits watched from the shadows, smoking cigars and sipping whiskey while they waited for the show. The invisible audience consisted of judges, politicians, cartel members, and Eastern European investors, all plugged into an encrypted betting network. But they weren't there for just any fighter. They were there for Elias' song. Elias stepped into the ring, shirtless, barefoot, his face calm. His body bore the marks of discipline, thin scars, hardened calluses, muscles built for function, not vanity. His silence irritated Price. He wanted spectacle. But he knew the real art lay in the calm before the storm. Across from Elias stood not Malone, as he'd suspected, but an old ghost. Wei Zhang, his former Shaolin brother-in-arms, vanished 5 years ago. Wei had been trained by the same master. But while Elias abandoned Kung Fu after the family tragedy, Wei went another way, selling his skills to the highest bidder. Now he stood in St. Redmond, hired as a guest fighter, brought in to break Elias live before the eyes of the entire criminal underworld. At the sight of Wei, Elias flinched for the first time. Not from fear, but memory. Childhood images. The temple. The day they learned Elias's sister, May, had been murdered during a covert operation overseas. No killer was ever named. Elias had walked away from it all after that. Wei, instead, dove headfirst into the world that destroyed them. "You should have stayed out of this, brother," Wei whispered before the fight began. Elias stayed silent. The gong struck. Wei exploded forward, blindingly fast, fists and kicks designed to end the fight in seconds. Elias slipped each blow with surgical precision, reading him like a book. He didn't strike back. He only defended. The crowd began to murmur. They wanted blood. Price's jaw tightened. Something was wrong. Elias wasn't fighting, he was measuring. And then, in the third minute, Elias whispered one word that froze Wei in his tracks. "May." Wei faltered. Elias seized the instant, moved like lightning, and dropped him to his knees with a single move. But he didn't finish. He stepped close and said, "You know who killed my sister, don't you?" Sweat pouring, Wei's face twisted between fear and regret. It was Price. He ordered it. She found out about the fight circuit while undercover in Mexico. He used prisons to scrub names. May tried to expose it and paid with her life. The entire prison seemed to freeze. The ring, the guards, the audience, everyone waited for the end. But Elias stepped back, released Wei, raised his eyes, and looked straight into the transmission camera, straight at Price. "The fight's over," he said, locking onto the lens. "Now it's your turn." In the control room, Price barked for the feed to be cut. But it was too late. Dempsey, hidden in the tech wing, had rerouted the broadcast to an external server, streaming the fight outside the prison, live. Every word, every face, every connection. That night, the FBI, DEA, and international agencies received anonymous data packages containing the entire fight and the files Dempsey had been collecting for weeks. It was the turning point. Elias wasn't there to fight. He was there to expose. Dragged from the ring by armed guards, Elias caught Dempsey's eye and gave a single nod. No words, but the message was clear. It's done. Dempsey triggered Phase 2 of the plan. On the surface, sirens wailed, helicopters closed in, and for the first time in years, the gates of St. Redmond Prison would open, not to free inmates, but to arrest the real criminals. The alarm thundered like a war siren, echoing through the cold walls of St. Redmond Prison. Guards scrambled in chaotic formation, unable to pinpoint where the real threat was coming from. From the watchtowers above, searchlights swept across the yard as if hunting for ghosts. But the ghosts were already exposed in broad daylight. The underground had been breached. The control that once seemed absolute was crumbling. Dempsey's leaked files had broken the dam. In less than 2 hours, Gareth Price's name was plastered across national news, tied to a multi-million-dollar network of underground fights, inmate deaths, and rigged sentences. Elias's face, captured during the fight with Wei Zhang, was replayed on screens around the world, but not in the way Price had planned. Elias wasn't shown as a criminal. He had become the whistleblower, the symbol of something far greater. Inside the prison, the ripple effect was instant. Factions began to retreat. Inmates who once backed Malone realized his reign of terror was over. Others tried to vanish, erase their tracks. Kurt Madsen, the white supremacist leader, was found unconscious in his cell, poisoned. Elchino Vargas, on the other hand, approached Elias in the yard, this time openly. They shook hands, no words. The war was over, at least between them. Malone, however, unraveled. He lost it when he realized he'd been used, that Price never intended to reward him. When he discovered Nico's death had been ordered by Price just to push Elias, the rage collapsed into desperation. Alone, abandoned, watching his crew scatter, he tried to stab Dempsey with a cell key, but was restrained. For the first time, Malone wasn't feared. He was just another broken man stripped bare. Elias, meanwhile, was taken to the medical wing under maximum watch. Not because he was injured, but for protection. He'd become too dangerous a symbol, both for those who wanted justice and those who wanted him silenced. But his focus was no longer on himself. He asked for a computer, not to escape, but to send a single coded message to Lucia, Vargas's sister, a name, an address, and one line: he wasn't alone. Outside, the political storm grew. Governors, wardens, and military justice officials were dragged into hearings, forced to explain how Price had operated under their noses for so long. Investigations spread to other prisons. Elias had lit the fuse to something much larger, and somehow he knew it wasn't over. In the underground, the monitors were smashed, the ring dismantled, the records encrypted, but Dempsey already had it all copied. And he wasn't alone. Other government agents who had been monitoring St. Redmond for months finally had hard proof. They hadn't come to save Elias, but he had become the spark no one saw coming. A man who only wanted to live in silence ended up shouting to the whole world. Wei Jiang was escorted out under protection. He agreed to cooperate in exchange for partial immunity. His confession about May's murder opened a new trail of investigation. But even he didn't know all the names involved, only that May had been on the brink of exposing a network of prisons used as testing grounds for clandestine paramilitary operations. Elias was kept in a special cell, not as punishment, but for protection. Many wanted him dead, others wanted to use him, but he remained true to what he'd always been, someone who only acted when necessary. And now, for the first time in years, peace settled in his eyes. Not because he'd won, but because he had chosen not to be just another pawn in the game. St. Redmond still stood, but everyone knew. Nothing inside those walls would ever be the same. The silence in Elias's special cell was no longer the same silence. Not empty, not bottled up. It was a different silence now, a silence of choice. After years of running from his past, repressing his instincts, Elias was finally beginning to see what he'd always avoided. He was never there by accident. St. Redmond hadn't been the end of his freedom, it was the start of his mission. In the days following Price's downfall, federal agents made constant visits. They wanted formal interrogations, testimony, identifications, and above all, names. Elias cooperated, but only enough. He knew dropping the entire truth without strategy could cost innocent lives. May had died trying to do the right thing too directly. Elias had learned from her mistake. Truth, sometimes, had to be prepared to survive the world. Meanwhile, Dempsey stayed at the center of the cleanup. Even when pressured to step back, he refused to walk away. He became the bridge between Elias and the outside. He sent coded reports to Lucia, cross-checked files with the FBI, and pieced together evidence pointing beyond the prison walls: judges, private security firms, politicians bankrolling the scheme. Elias knew his role was no longer about one fight. He was waging an invisible war from the inside out, but the biggest shift wasn't political, it was within his soul. Elias returned to training every day, not to defend himself, but to reconnect. Breathing cycles, silent kata on the floor. Ideograms traced with his finger in the dust, no longer escape, now rebuilding. Slowly, he stopped carrying just the weight of guilt and started carrying purpose. One day, while meditating, he was surprised by an unexpected visitor. Wei Zhang, now under protective custody, asked to see him. They sat across from each other, separated by a pane of glass. The silence was there, yes. But this time, it wasn't tense. It was heavy with meaning. Wei, crushed by guilt and the choices he'd made, looked at Elias and said, "May protected you like her own blood. I failed you both." Elias answered calmly, "There's still time. What you know can stop others from dying like she did." It wasn't a moment of hate or vengeance. It was two men, once brothers, choosing not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Outside, Lucia and Vargas played their pieces with precision. Using Elias's name as a shield, they gained access to sealed files and struck alliances with federal agents in Washington. Elias had become more than an ex-inmate. He was living proof that the entire system was compromised. His silence, once mistaken for weakness, was now understood as discipline that inspired action. Meanwhile, St. Redmond itself was transforming. Corrupt guards removed, wings shut down, gangs that once seemed untouchable dissolved. Elias had become unwillingly a symbol of order. Inmates watched him with respect, not as a leader, but as someone who had faced the system's worst and stayed standing. Weeks later, Dempsey brought him an offer: transfer into a special witness protection program. Elias refused. He said he'd only leave once the last name tied to May's death was exposed. He didn't want to disappear. He wanted to close the circle, and he knew closing it meant one final choice: telling the truth about himself. Until then, not even investigators knew who Elias really was. The fraud conviction was still his official cover. But now he decided to reveal everything: his training, his international ties, his entry into the country under another name. He wrote it all in an official document, signed and added to the Price case files. At the very end of the testimony, he left a single line, like a stone set in the path for those who'd come after. It's not about fighting. It's about knowing when to stop running. And there, for the first time in many years, Elias Song took a deep breath and felt no weight in his chest. Gareth Price's name had become a national scandal. Senators were calling for inquiries. International intelligence agencies were moving fast, uncovering that the underground fight network stretched far beyond US borders. And at the eye of the storm, Elias Song remained in custody, not as a prisoner anymore, but as a key piece in a global puzzle. At St. Redmond, the atmosphere had turned volatile. Even with many of Price's men removed, the calm was deceptive. Dempsey could feel it. The silence in the halls was too heavy, the inmates' stares too long, the lack of conflict too deliberate. It meant only one thing: someone was waiting for the right moment to strike, and that someone had a name: Kane Beckett. One of Price's former investors and an ex-special operations agent. He never appeared in the files, always used proxies, but now, with the system exposed and names spilling out, he was cornered. And when predators are cornered, they bite back. Beckett wasn't planning to run. He was planning to erase the one living threat left: Elias. Meanwhile, Elias faced a parade of visitors. Lawyers, national security reps, even UN observers. Everyone wanted guarantees. He offered only truths. His last testimony had rattled the foundations, sparking investigations in 4 states and leading to the arrest of judges, prosecutors, and businessmen. The world was beginning to see how deep the rot went. But one piece was still missing. Lucia sent a coded message. Beckett is moving. He wants to silence you before the trial. Vargas, upon hearing it, offered his own men inside the prison to protect Elias. But Elias refused. He simply said, "If he comes, I'll be ready." That same night, The FBI intercepted a classified comm. A clandestine operation was set to go down inside the prison. The plan was simple: embed 3 men in the transfer team and take Elias out during transport to the federal hearing. Stage a botched escape. Make it look like an accident, leave no trace. Dempsey was the first to object. He refused to green-light the transfer that day, demanded special protection. But his authority was limited. Elias would be moved in 72 hours, with or without approval. The clock was ticking. Knowing this, Elias went back to training. His special cell once again became a makeshift dojo, not out of fear, but precision. He knew the final moment was coming, and it wasn't about survival anymore. It was about finishing what his sister had started. The night before the transfer, something unexpected happened. Malone, still in isolation since the network's collapse, sent a message through a guard. He wanted to speak to Elias. For security, the meeting took place in the mess hall under heavy watch. When they met, Malone was thinner, his eyes weary. But something had shifted, a quiet respect. "I didn't know about May," Malone said softly. "If I had, maybe I would have done things different." Elias only replied, "Now you know, and you still get to choose what you do with it." Malone didn't ask forgiveness. He didn't threaten either. He just nodded. On transfer day, the sun had yet to rise. The corridor was clear, the transport van idling with its engine on. 3 armed federal agents stood guard. Everything looked routine. But as Elias stepped inside, he already knew. The danger wasn't outside, it was inside. And as the van rolled away from St. Redmond's walls, the silence was cut by a faint sound, the metallic click of a gun being cocked. The climax was in motion. And there would be no turning back. The armored van felt like a moving steel coffin. The lights were off, the air dry, every vibration of the engine ticking down like a countdown. Elias sat with eyes half shut, shoulders loose, as if meditating. But inside, his senses were razor sharp. He registered everything: the body weight of the agent beside him, the faint smell of rust on the driver's left hand, the uneven breathing of the man in the back. And then he heard it. The second click. The holster strap snapping open. Elias moved without hesitation. In a flash, he leaned sideways and drove his elbow up into the jaw of the agent beside him. A silent, precise strike that dropped the man cold before he could draw. The second spun around, pistol in hand, but Elias was already on him. He used the first man's body as a shield, closing the gap, twisting the second's arm until the bone cracked with a snap. The third reached for his weapon, but Elias disarmed him with a kick to the wrist, followed by a chokehold that put him down fast. The whole thing lasted less than 7 seconds, silent, surgical. The van kept rolling down the desert highway as if nothing had happened. Elias was now in control. He grabbed the dash radio and keyed Dempsey, who was waiting at an intercept point. 3 down, driver's clean. I can still deliver the package, Elias said, calm as a soldier. Dempsey replied, "Beckett won't accept defeat. He'll find you, Elias. You know that. Then we finish it today." The van veered off the main route onto a side road, heading for an old abandoned hangar where Dempsey's team was staged. But they weren't alone. Beckett was already there. He knew Elias would survive. He knew he'd be hunted, and so he decided to hunt first. The hangar was a trap. When Elias arrived, the gate creaked open, lights glowing inside, but no one visible. He stepped out, body loose but every sense primed. He walked to the center where a single chair waited, on it a phone, ringing. He picked it up. "Elias," Beckett's voice came cold, calculated. "Your sister was brilliant, but like everyone too righteous, she was predictable. You, though, you surprised me. I'm not here to talk. Neither am I." The lights went out. Metal scraped in the shadows. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, breathed, prepared. Beckett emerged with 2 armed men. But these weren't amateurs, ex-military like him. One lunged first. Elias slipped past with minimal motion, using the man's momentum against him, snapping his arm under his own weight. The second grabbed from behind, but Elias spun him off his hip and finished with a kick to the throat. That left Beckett. "You're not just a fighter," Beckett said, stepping closer. "You're a reminder of what we tried to erase." Elias didn't answer. The fight was brutal. Beckett fought with raw power and military precision, Elias with ancestral discipline and speed. It was a clash of worlds, one forged in war, the other in silence and training. Blows, knees, blocks, takedowns. The thud of strikes echoed through the hangar like muffled thunder. Elias had the edge in movement. Beckett made up for it with fury. But in the final exchange, Elias swept him off balance with a short trip, locked his arm between his legs, and in one swift, sharp motion, immobilized him. But he didn't kill him. With his hand gripping Beckett's throat, Elias looked him in the eyes and said, "You killed my sister, but you won't make me become you." He stood, left Beckett on the floor. Dempsey, arriving with reinforcements, secured the scene. That night, Kane Beckett was arrested. That night, justice took a step forward. That night, Elias chose the real climax, not killing the enemy, but breaking the cycle. The trial of Gareth Price, Kane Beckett, and the others tied to the underground fight network became one of the most closely watched cases of the decade. For weeks, Elias Song's name echoed in headlines, in the halls of power, and in closed-door meetings between international agencies. But Elias didn't seek interviews. He turned down tributes. He never chased the spotlight. He did his duty in court, handed over evidence, testified, and then asked for silence. The prosecution offered him full immunity for his cooperation, along with lifetime protection under a new name and identity. Elias refused. He chose to remain in the US under supervised freedom, but as himself. He didn't want to vanish again. "Justice isn't a place to hide," he told the federal judge at the end of the trial. "It's a place you keep walking, even when everything else is over." Lucia Vargas carried on the investigations, backed by Dempsey and international task forces. The information Elias had provided spread into other prisons, other countries. May, Elias's sister, had not died in vain. Her work had become a living mission, now carried on by many hands. A cycle of silence and fear had been broken by a man who, ironically, almost never raised his voice. Wei Jiang, now under protective custody, began cooperating with the government. His intel dismantled illegal operations across Asia and Eastern Europe. In one of his last messages to Elias, he wrote, "We were trained to resist death, but you taught me to resist guilt." Elias never replied, but he folded the note carefully and placed it beneath a stone at the abandoned Shaolin temple where he had once trained. Malone, transferred to another prison, stayed quiet. He never sought Elias again. But strangely, he defended him in his own testimony, saying, "No one in that place had the right to call him a prisoner." There was no explicit redemption, but maybe in the end, there was a trace of respect, not for the fighter, but for the man who refused to become a monster. Now free on parole, Elias rented a small room above a bookstore in a quiet town. He lived simply, teaching martial arts to at-risk youth. He never spoke of the past. He didn't need to. His movements spoke for him. Every strike, every breath, every lesson was a reminder that the greatest battle isn't against the enemy. It's against what the enemy tries to turn you into. Months later, an unmarked envelope appeared in the bookstore's mailbox. Inside, a single photo, an empty ring